Welcome to Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and on this episode, I'm going to be speaking to Alexandra Carroll. Alexandra is a Christian apologist and a lover of science. She studied theology at the famed Oxford University in the UK, and she also received a master's degree in conservation biology from Victoria University in Wellington. Her background includes parasitology, human cell biology, and restoration ecology. And yes, I did have to look down at my notes to make sure that I got all of those right. Alexandra is an itinerant speaker for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and a writer for several different blogs. When she is not travelling the globe on speaking tours, she enjoys hiking in the mountains of her home in Colorado. Without any further ado, let's have this important conversation about the great debate, if you like, or is it, between faith and science. Alexandra, thank you so much for being on the show this evening. I was thinking back the other day in preparation for this conversation about the first time we met, and I remember we were both invited to be guest speakers at a conference for something called Thinking Matters here in New Zealand, and I think it was in Tauranga actually, and I heard you speak there on this whole issue of faith and science, and I was just hugely impressed. The quality of what you had to say, but even more importantly, you were someone who struck me as you didn't have one of the big traps of, I guess, being involved in public speaking is the ego trip. And you were just genuinely passionate about these issues of science and faith and the intersection of the two. And I thought it was such a great thing.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. I feel a little bit, here I am interviewing a scientist and I don't have any leather patches on my elbow and I'm not smoking I was going to say cigar.
It's a shame.
Yeah, I'm not qualified as a pipe. Tell us, though, a little bit about your scientific background and your qualifications so we can get a feel for who you are in the field of sciences.
Yeah, sure. So I did an undergraduate here in the United States, and my focus during my research at that time was parasitology, the study of parasites. I was very interested in particularly the animal behavior aspect of this because it's possible for a parasite to infect a host and change its behavior quite radically. So that was something that I was looking into. Although I will say for those of you out there who are thinking about going into parasitology, that just be prepared that your social life will probably plummet because people don't want to hang out with you when you've been dealing with parasites all day. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And then from there, I moved on to Oxford, where I studied philosophy and theology at the Center for Apologetics there. Yeah. And then I came to New Zealand, where I met you and many other fabulous Kiwis to do a master's degree in conservation biology. And my focus at that time was passerine species, or perching birds of the Northern Island. And it was a restoration project that I was a part of to see how we can keep vulnerable species from continuing to decline. So, yeah.
Wow. To me, it's fascinating. I would have thought that if you were into parasitology, am I saying that right? Parasitology.
Well done.
Look at that. That there would be plenty of interesting social conversations that you could have in that field. Tell me though, what motivated you to actually want to be a scientist? When was it that you knew I want to do science? I want to actually do this as a career.
You know, I think it began on a family vacation to Hawaii. And we went there, I think I must have been 9 or 10, still rather young. And I absolutely fell in love with the rainforest. Just the diversity and, I mean, just the way that it feels, so close and so heavy and so full of life. Everywhere you look, there's something different and extraordinary, all these hidden gems at every turn. And I became fascinated with the rainforest. And I began, picking up books and reading. My mom was a children's librarian at the time, so I was reading up every book I could find on the rainforest. And it was then that I started to learn about the degradation of the rainforest and how so much of it was being destroyed. And that's when I started learning more about conservation, and if there's possibly anything that one little person could do to help, that's what I wanted to do. But from the time I was really young, I've always been interested in biology, and I've been blessed to have parents who stop to look at things. We'd be on a walk and they'd stop and say, wow, look at this interesting little caterpillar. And we'd sit there and watch a caterpillar for a few minutes, and so that was a blessing for sure.
How do you respond to anyone who might say, how can you be a person of faith and a scientist? Aren't these two things at odds with each other? Isn't this one of the great debates of the last 150, 200 years?
I don't always blame people for thinking that, because on the offset, it does seem like there is this inherent contradiction or some sort of war going on at the base of this, even from the time of Wilberforce and Huxley doing their great debate at the Pitt Rivers Museum ages and ages ago, talking about what is the answer to all these big questions. Do we go to macroevolution, or do we go to creation? What are the answers? And there have been sort of philosophical wars, you could say, between the church and certain forms of sciences that we could cite. But really, honestly, as I've continued in this field and as I've continued learning particularly the history of science, I've come to believe that it's not a conflict between faith and science at all. Those things are not at opposition. And in fact, they can't be in opposition. It's not possible for them to be in opposition. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But for the offset, I'll just say that, science is extremely limited. There are a lot of answers that science can't give us. Not to say that we should ever have blind faith, meaning you just believe in something because someone tells you that it's true. But where we are standing now is on top of this gigantic mountain of wonderful scientific theories that everyone believed at one time, which we've discarded because we found that they weren't true. You look at what people thought about light. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? And then you've got, people passing light through a prism and saying, well, it's got to be corpuscular, it's got to be particulate because of how it, but then you've got the slit theory and all of those experiments. And so, well, it's both a particle and a wave. And that's over like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, that dialogue. And a lot of people used to believe things that, for example, our world, is it heliocentric? Do we move around the sun, or does the sun move around us? Right? That was another big debate. So I don't think that the conflict is between science and faith at all. I think it's between different worldviews, different ways of seeing reality, and quite frequently it's simply just a conflict between atheism and theism. You look at some of the early cosmonauts and astronauts and some of the things that they were saying. Yuri, when the first man to walk in space, he was a Russian cosmonaut, and he said, I am here and I don't see God. So this proves that I have been able to employ my scientific mind to prove once and for all that God does not exist. Yeah. And then you send a bunch of Yankees up there, right? A bunch of American guys. And what do on Christmas? They read from the Bible. They read from Genesis.
That's right.
And, so all these men, they were doing the same scientific effort. In a sense, they were on the same scientific team, but they had different worldviews. And that's, I think, where the conflict really is.
Do you feel that you have to navigate the world of science, if you like, as a person of faith? Or do you compartmentalize it? You say, well, that's my scientific life, that's my faith life, or is there a marriage of the two for you?
I used to try to do that, Brendan. I used to try to keep those things separate in my life. And I found that It's a terrible thing to do because I was robbing myself twice. Um, my belief in God enriches my science and my scientific understanding so deeply. And in the same way, my pursuit of science inspires me to worship God more and more because I'm discovering what the Creator has made. So those two things, they don't negate from each other. They actually feed into each other in this really beautiful way. So I definitely don't try to compartmentalize them at all. At the end of the day, I want to understand reality, and I want to understand what's real and what's true. And science is a wonderful vector for doing that. And also, faith is a wonderful vector for doing that. Faith answers many questions of reality that science simply can't answer. So I think they do work in hand quite beautifully. Hand in hand quite beautifully.
Do you think that your faith is, because I guess some people would try and say this, they would say it's a hindrance, or do you think it's an advantage when you practice science?
I think it depends on the kind of faith that you have. There are certain kinds of faiths that directly go against science. And I would strongly recommend against those. So earlier on, I mentioned blind faith, which is just believing in something because you want it to be true, or it makes you feel good, or someone has told you that it's true, but you don't actually have reasons for believing in that. And that directly goes against reality because you can basically just be making up your own reality, right? But biblical faith is quite different because biblical faith, is based on oftentimes our experiences, our observations of reality. So it's another way that we can understand the world around us. I always think of this like a tree. So most people, when they look at a tree, they see the trunk and the branches and the leaves, and they say, well, that's a tree, right, from the ground up. But that's only half of the tree, actually. More than 50% of the biomass of a tree is underground. More than half of it is in the root system. And I think, science is a wonderful place to start. Science is beautiful, and I love it. And I obviously have spent a lot of my years pursuing it. But it's not the end. There's so much more, and faith offers an extension of understanding that goes beyond. It can answer questions of purpose, which science can't, and questions of agency, which science can't. So that's kind of my view on that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think if people understand the history of science, I want to come back and talk about this in a minute, because I think there's a bit of a false history out there about when people think about science and the history of the world. But you go back to the early scientists, and it's fascinating how, first of all, I've heard a lot of philosophers of science talk about this, the idea that without the Christian worldview, where God is not part of his creation, who he's separate from it, you couldn't really do science. You couldn't even begin the scientific endeavor, because it's almost like a blasphemy, if you like, to interfere with God if he is the creation and not separate from it. But also this idea of a lot of scientists really seem to be viewing their work as a form of worship that they're doing, right, when they actually do science.
Yeah. And I view, well, I think science can cause, or my discoveries and my understanding, the things that I can gain from doing science, lead me to worship. And, the whole religion versus science thing gets really confusing, because those are things that you tack on to yourself, right? Those are affinities, those are interests. But Christianity is not something that you tack onto your life. It's about the person of Christ, who you give your entire self to. Everything in me I have given to Christ. And the beautiful thing about that is he doesn't ask me to stop being who I was before. So he doesn't ask me to stop being a scientist or stop being interested and inquisitive and wondering, what about this? What about, how does this work? It's actually more of a completion of that, a realization of that, where our identity is hidden in Christ in such a way that when we give ourselves over to him, we become who we were always meant to be. He makes us more us, in a sense. And so I have found that my science has flourished since the time when there was a time actually when I sort of walked away from him, but in the time that I've come back, my science has actually flourished, and my ability to think well has flourished as well.
It's interesting, the whole issue of faith versus science you've raised, and to me it's always been a false dichotomy. I've never understood this, but I understand why it exists, because I think a lot of people don't understand the history of it. And I want to talk about some of the excesses as well that have crept into science in just a minute. But I think what's really going on, as a non-scientific layman, if you like, is I get the sense that there's really it's more of a struggle for the soul of science that's going on, rather than faith versus science. It's a view of, like, I think you've already alluded to this, your worldview, your philosophy of, and your anthropology, the person of what reality is. And it seems to me that there's one side who wants science to be this thing where it is the only source of truth, if you like, or the natural sciences are. The idea of a marriage between, say, science and maybe philosophy, we'll let you away with that, but certainly not theology. That would be anathema. And it seems to me that's more of the struggle that's going on here.
Absolutely, Brendan, absolutely. And I find it fascinating that theology used to be called the queen of the sciences.
That's right.
It was in that same camp. And the philosophy that you mentioned actually has a name. It's called scientism. Yeah. And scientism is a viewpoint. It's a philosophy that says if science can't answer a question, nothing can. You can't believe it if science can't give you the green light, basically, on anything. So if science can't prove that it's true, it can't possibly be true. And it's quite a dogmatic ideology, actually. And I've had very dear friends of mine who were atheists who ascribed to this scientism. And when they began to question, maybe, is it possible that there's some sort of super mind behind all of this? A lot of computer scientists come to this because they're like, there's got to be more. Or astrophysicists sometimes too stay up late at night wondering, worrying, twirling their thumbs. This doesn't look right. This looks rigged. Like, there's got to be something behind all of this. But when they start asking those questions, oftentimes they're chastised quite strongly by other people in their atheistic communities. So we do have to be aware of that and be, I think, tenderhearted to them, that there's a very strong level of dogmatism in scientism. Even though they would say, they wouldn't call it a religion, it kind of is one. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the excesses I think we see in science is, and again, this is about how if you understand the history of science, you'll know there's no problem here. But if you think that the world was basically a period of darkness right up until perhaps Bacon, and then, then science magically arose out of the ether, out of nothing and out of nowhere, and then we changed the world for the better and we got rid of all those dark ages superstitions, then of course you're going to think this, this way about the world. But it seems to me, if you understand the history of science and how in actual fact science has been going on for, even within, so the 2,000 years of Christianity, right from the very beginning, you can see the practice of science there. But what's interesting is now Bacon gives rise to, intentionally or otherwise, the whole idea of empiricism. If it's we'll only believe it if it can be empirically proven to be true. And one of the things you just talked about, it got me thinking about how it seems to me that in the sciences sometimes people will go looking for anything but the possibility of a divine super being behind it all. So instead we get, I've heard even people now talking about the idea of we're living in a matrix, or maybe there's an alien mind behind it all. And I'm thinking, to me, that's, it's just, it's to me that at that point, it really does seem like that empiricism is getting in the way of actual pursuit of truth.
Indeed it is. And one thing that I like to do is sort of, I'm always flip-flopping back, and I've got one foot in the pond of science and one foot in the pond of philosophy. But to sort of jump both feet into the philosophy side for a moment, I just sit back and I wonder, what's the cause there? Why would people stop and say, well, even Richard Dawkins himself, when pressed, will say, well, maybe some form of panspermiogenesis, right? There's got to be aliens out there who seeded life on Earth, because the jump from non-life to life is just insane, basically. I mean, it's very, very challenging to answer that without outside help. So it's got to be aliens. And you've got to sit back and wonder, well, why is it? Because logically, it's not more feasible. right?
Yeah, that's right.
Logically, it's not more feasible. We've got three options here for the universe. Only three. Either the universe always existed, it's eternal, it has no beginning or end,
Yeah.
or it came into existence and it had no cause, just popped into existence, or it came into existence because it was caused by God. And those are your only three options. And that's really difficult because people are constantly being funneled back towards this God. And I think part of the answer of why people are avoiding that conclusion so strongly is because there are moral ramifications there.
Yeah.
There are. If there is a God who loves you, who wants to be in relationship with you and wants you to come to him and ask forgiveness for the things that you've done in your life, and seek a right relationship with the living God, that's terrifying.
Exactly.
That is absolutely terrifying. So aliens, probably. Let's go there. I mean, not everyone goes down that way, but a lot of them do. And actually, a friend of mine, he's a historian, and he lived in Oxford at the same time that I did, and he had the privilege of reading Huxley's diary, which he was writing around the same time that he was doing this debate with Wilberforce in the Pitt Rivers Museum. And he specifically cited several times that one of the reasons why he was being so firm against this idea of God was because he wanted to live his own life. And he particularly mentioned sexual liberation several times. So a lot of this, I think, comes down to we want to live life our own way. And we know better than to let ourselves go down a philosophical trail that might be dangerous.
It's interesting, is that I think one of the things that I'm a little bit concerned by, and this is something that C.S. Lewis talked about a lot. He called science, or there's a potential within science, and particularly he's thinking about scientism here, which you've already mentioned. He called it the magician's twin. And one of the things that he worried about with science that fell into scientism, and the way that it's now become so ingrained in governance, policy setting, everything, it's just such an influence in our lives, was that he said, unlike magic, magic's not real. You know, someone can't turn up and say, you know, I'm going to make gold out of thin air. They can't do that. They can trick you with an illusion, but they can't do that. But he says science actually has a power that can really do things. And believe it or not, that makes it extremely dangerous because it's so attractive to people who like wielding power. And I think that's a concern for. Are you concerned by the way in which now scientism seems to be becoming more and more of a stronghold, if you like, in the way we do society?
Science does not concern me at all. Scientism concerns me very deeply. Science, I feel, is a gift from God. It's a way that he gave us to understand nature, so that we can understand him more. And it's a beautiful gift. And it can be abused. Like so many vessels of knowledge, it can be abused in terrible ways and has been and will continue to be. But scientism, yeah, I find that deeply concerning because I think it gives too much authority where authority is not due. And it reminds me of, I mean, we've done this for eons, Brendan. You can look down through our history as a human race, and it just goes on and on. I mean, you think of the Mayan civilization and how they gave all the power to the priests. Whatever the priest said was rule. You did not question anything. If he said it, it was done. Yeah. And we're making science our priest because of scientism, and it's not a good leader. Even some of the greatest anti-theist writers and thinkers of our age are saying the same thing in a roundabout way. I mean, there's an interview, I think, with Richard Dawkins that you can look up where he talks about this crazy thing that happened in Great Britain on this cooking show, and this man made this terrible idea. He thought it would be funny, but it turned out to not be funny. And what he did was, this couple had a baby, and he convinced the wife to save the placenta, which is basically a genetic clone of the baby, right? Yeah. And then the chef cooked up the placenta into a pate and served it to a bunch of dinner guests, including the husband, who had several helpings. So he was basically eating his own baby's clone without knowing it, right? And now Dawkins comments on this, and he says something I find very significant. He says, science can tell you that placenta is technically a genetic clone of the baby girl. but it cannot tell you whether or not it's right to eat it.
Yeah.
Science cannot answer questions about morality and ethics. And I see this trend again and again and again, that people are trying to answer ethical, moral questions with science.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think the most extreme case I think of probably is someone like Sam Harris, who he's a weird character in many ways because he's tried to keep sort of an atheist spirituality as well. It's like he's thrown out the baby, but with the bathwater, he wants the baby back. But he's got this marriage between sort of various spiritualities and atheism, but then he also he's written a whole work trying to claim that you can get morality from science, and the reality is that it's actually impossible, and it's extremely dangerous, right?
Well, and one of the things I think that sets Harris apart from the other of the four horsemen is he's a very deep feeler.
Yes.
And he senses things about himself and about humanity. And I think he has rightly so sensed that we are moral beings and we are spiritual beings. And as a thinker, it's his job to answer that with his philosophy. And he's really tried his best. And I'm convinced many people, but it doesn't work. Actually, it does fall flat on its face, because morality is a type of a law, and you can't have a law without a lawgiver.
You've talked about the whole idea of science as the guide and the master, and it seems that we're not really learning the lesson from this either. There's a guy called Hilaire Belloc who wrote an essay in the 1930s called The New Paganism. And one of the things he worried about, it's very prophetic what he's saying, but what he was worried about was he could see what he called a new paganism growing in the West. And the thing that he said that worried him most was this marriage. Really, a lot of it was built around technology and science. And he said the thing that would be sacrificed on the altar of this new paganism, because, paganism has human sacrifice of some kind, he says the sacrifice on that altar would be human dignity. And, It seems to me he was very prescient. But here's the thing. You look at a science that's not subservient to the moral order, like, say, eugenics, the practices of the Nazi experimentation program and what they were doing and their awful atrocities. You'd think that we would maybe learn that lesson, but it seems we keep failing to recognize what lay at the heart of some of that stuff.
But think of all the things that we learned from the eugenics program. Think of all the science that was done. Fascinating experiments done on twins. And it's true. There are terrible, terrible shadows in our very near memories. And we cannot suppress them, nor should we, lest we be damned to repeat them, right?
Yeah.
So yes, and I do think, as you well know, my other job, I'm a hospice worker. I do in-home hospice care, and human dignity is such an important part of being a person. Your inherent dignity, your inherent value, your inherent worth. And science would look at something and would try to, we see this all the time in conservation biology, where it's an instrumental value, right? What does it do, and how do we value it because of what it does for me?
Yeah.
There's a joke in New Zealand, the best way to preserve kiwis from going extinct is to start making kiwi burgers, kiwi hamburgers, because if we eat them, everyone will want to start breeding them, and that, but that's instrumental value, right? As opposed to keeping them on this planet because they're here and because they exist and because they have a right to exist. And people will do that all the time in conservation biology. They'll look at a place and they'll say, what's the instrumental value of this location? What's the instrumental value of that location? Okay, we're going to preserve this, and we're going to chop that forest down. Conservation biology is the only science that I know of that is based on value judgments, which is fascinating. But the thing is, now we're trying to do this with people. We're trying to analyze people as instrumentally valuable, not inherently valuable, right? My Constitution talks about how people were created with inalienable rights, how we take certain truths to be self-evident because everyone was created by the same creator, and that elicits a sense of inherent value that can never be taken away, no matter how you look, no matter how much money you have, no matter what your smarts are. And now we have this scientism, coming in, becoming our priest, telling us what to do. And we've put the crown on this philosophy that says, I will judge you by what you can do. That's your worth. And that's why we see all sorts of things happening. Abortions, rampant, the most insane numbers we've ever seen, hopefully ever will see. And of course, we see in end-of-life care here in Colorado, we, a couple of years ago, passed a bill that allowed for early extermination of life for the elderly or disabled. And that has had severe ramifications on hospice care. And I've had some really dark experiences because of assisted suicide and what that's doing in my state. So human dignity, it's incredibly important. We should not take it for granted, nor should we allow scientism to throw it aside.
And it's fascinating because what you've just said there, even in making that statement, it's incredibly important. We should always respect it. That is not a scientific claim. And science can tell you all the wonderful things about the human body. It can tell you all the amazing things about the human brain. It can give you a very fascinating and deep insight, even though there's so much of the mystery we still don't understand. But we know a lot more than what we did 200 years ago. But what it can't do is tell you what you should do with all of that. Should you respect it or not? And that's the core struggle, right?
Right. And here's another thing that science can't tell you, which is very, very inconvenient for where we're going as a society now. If you take the philosophy of scientism and what it says, we could boil it down to that one phrase. If science can't prove that it's true, it must be false. Okay, so let's take that sentence and package it up. Now let's apply that philosophy to that sentence. Can science prove that if science can't prove it, it can't be believed?
Exactly.
No. So scientism fails by its own requirements. It's a reductio ad absurdum argument. You can't actually logically say, in order for something to be believable, science has to prove it, because the minute those words come out of your mouth, your own words have committed suicide. Yeah. They're dead. They have no life. They have no meaning. Yeah. But again, so many people who are very well versed in the sciences, they're not well versed in philosophy. And they say these things with great conviction that actually have no meaning or weight at all.
We've talked a bit about the sort of the struggle going on within science, if you like, or that whole debate, and we've talked from the scientific side. But I think it was it was a previous Catholic Pope, Pope John Paul II, who said one of the big problems tend to arise whenever you get scientists who presume to be theologians and theologians who presume to be scientists. Have you ever experienced things on the faith side of this equation when it comes to the seeming clash between the two, where you think, man, that could have been better. We could have done that better, and it's sort of almost like a rejection of science, if you like.
Yeah. Quite frequently, and I'm actually really grateful that you bring this up, because I don't ever just want to point the blame on one side. I mean, both sides are really failing here, which is why we're having this conversation. But there have been many times when I've told someone who was a believer my background or the fact that I'm a scientist. And I remember having a conversation with the mom of a friend of mine from junior high school, random. I forget where I bumped into her. And I was talking to her about what I was doing these days and all this stuff, and told her that I was a scientist. And she started to get real concerned and started asking me some personal questions. She's like, "Are you still walking with the Lord?" And I said, yes, oh, of course. I just got back from being a missionary in Africa. But she went away still very concerned, and she said, "I will pray for you." But there's this assumption that if you're going to be in the sciences, it must mean that you aren't looking to God for answers and you're only looking to science for answers. And that is preposterous. If I am fascinated with the Model T and how it works, and I want to take it apart and I want to look at the engine, and I'm so fascinated by how it's put together and how it runs, does that mean that I have stopped believing in Ford?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, to
Yeah.
the contrary, it probably means I appreciate him more,
Mm-hmm.
right? I remember my father taking me to, my father is an artist, and he took me to this beautiful collection of Monets
Yeah.
here in the Denver Art Museum. And he was teaching me all about the Impressionists and how they used light and all of these things. And by the time we exited the museum, my love and appreciation for Monet was greater, not less, because
Yeah.
of seeing all these things that he'd made. And that's how I feel about science. You know, I look at something under a microscope and it just blows my mind. Or I study, you know, human blood cell behavior and all these incredible, the intricate dances of, you know, hemoglobin and how red cells stack on top of each other, which nobody understands how or why they do this, but it's incredibly beautiful and strange. And it all makes me fall more in love with my
Mm.
creator. And there is this fear in the church. There's fear that science is evil. And that saddens me. And I think that fear, I don't want to say it's justified, but I can understand where it comes from, because science has been used as a bludgeon to bash away the church
Yep.
for hundreds of years. And it's not that, it's actually a gift from God.
Tell me, one of the big things we hear a lot about really is the whole origins of human life debate. That seems to be one of the big, when you talk about bludgeons, cudgels used against the church. How do you confront that question if people say to you, what about the book of Genesis? You know, Genesis is saying something completely different. How can you reconcile this? Because it seems to me that's something I constantly come up against, is people who say, again, who are outside of Christianity, who want to claim an expertise about how Scripture is, which is fascinating in and of itself, but they say, nope, you can't marry the two up.
Right. Well, I think you can't marry the two up if you're treating the Bible like a science textbook. Of course you can't. This all comes back to, what is the Bible? Why was it written? What is it? What's it for? How am I supposed to approach this thing, right? And I think, you know, for example, let's say that you go to your mailbox tomorrow morning and wait, this isn't going to work. You don't have the IRS. I don't know what they're called. I'll use mine.
The IRD.
IRD.
Yeah.
You get a letter from the IRD. You see the envelope there that's written there, and you think, oh no, maybe I'm in trouble. Maybe I have money. Maybe something went wrong with my finances, and you're full of anxiety. Different scenario, you pull out an envelope from one of your dear family members that you haven't heard from in a while, whom you really love and you've been waiting to hear from, right? And it's a letter of just reconnection, right? And I feel like the Bible is more the latter. And so people approach it like it's something that's trying to trap them or destroy them. And certainly there's a level of conviction here. It's hard when you read it because it can expose some of your faults, but that's beautiful. That's part of what happens to bring a human heart to God, right? And in the same way, sometimes people try and read it like a science textbook, which it isn't at all.
Yeah.
And there are things that we read, not just with regards to Genesis. There are things that we read in the New Testament. I remember one time reading this passage about women, you shouldn't braid your hair. And I thought, whoa, wow, I've been sinning almost every night and didn't know it, you know?
Well, that's two, mate. So you're a hair braiding hussy and a scientist. There's no hope for you.
There's no hope. I'm doomed. But, you know, you go back and you think, you've got to ask, who was this written to and why? And you go back and you learn about what that meant in Corinth at that time, that women were braiding hair and topping it on top of their heads as a form of sort of competition. And the best hairstyle had the greatest social status. And Jesus is saying, no, we're done with that. There is no slave or free or Jew or Greek. We're all equal. We're all equal because of Christ, right? So don't worry about trying to earn other people's approval with how you look. And in the same way, people come to Genesis and they read, oh, okay, well, it's talking about, you know, there was day and there was night, but then we know that the sun wasn't created until this day. So how could there have been light before there was sun? And like science, use your brain. Obviously, Genesis is false. And I just step back and I say, well, hold on a minute. Yeah. Let's ask the question of why Genesis was written, who it was written for, right? And we know that this is written, it's very poetic. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's written very specifically in this beautiful cadence of realms and rulers, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? Realms and rulers. And it's at the end of the day, what is it saying? It's saying, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. That's the main takeaway. And the level of care and the level of goodness that we read on these pages, and how every time he created, he stopped and he stepped back and he looked at it and he said, it's good.
Yeah.
That's beautiful to me. And that teaches me so much about our creation and so much about God. So it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that we're reading it wrong. If we look at it, we can read the Psalms and read in the Psalms, well, there's a psalm that says that the trees clap their hands for joy. And we know that trees don't have hands. Biology has never once found a handed tree. Therefore, the Bible is false. No, it's talking about how all of nature is bursting with joy, bursting with rejoicing because of its creator. It can't help but praise him. And it's this image of how he sustains the earth. So yeah, I do think that it is an expression of truth. It leads us to truth, but it's not supposed to be it's not supposed to be read in such a black and white way as a textbook is.
That's right. And that was a big breakthrough for me, I think, personally, was the realization that Scripture, but in particular here we're talking about Genesis, it's not written as a modern historical account. It's not written as a scientific textbook. It is true in the sense that it is written to tell us some very important truths about who we are and about who God is. And so chief among them, obviously, is that he exists, that he is all-powerful, that he created, that it was deliberate. There was a fall, all those profound truths that are there. And I think for me, like when I was a lot younger, I used to be a literal 7-day creationist. I was a lot younger because I had this idea, this fear that if you tried to say it was anything else, then you were saying that the scriptures were false. And when I came to realize in actual fact that's not the way that scripture is written, it was quite a transformative thing. And you realize there's no conflict anymore at that point. And that in actual fact, I'm interested to know your position. This is what I'm getting to, is I want to know what your position is on this, if you're comfortable sharing this. But for me, I would now probably consider myself what I think some people term themselves as evolutionary creationists. For me, the actual mechanism that God uses is actually not the important bit. The important bit is that the end product of that mechanism was intended, it was willed, he always knew that's what was going to be, and that the human soul was deliberately created, and it wasn't just a random thing that happened by chance. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question of the whole evolution debate. Where do you fall in that camp, on that
right.
debate?
Yeah, so I'm actually between where you started and where you ended up.
Yeah.
So you started as a young Earth creationist, right?
Yeah.
7 literal days.
Yeah.
And then from there you progress to more of a theistic evolution,
Yes.
believing that God created the earth through a process of macroevolution. That's how life progressed on Earth. So I'm in the middle of those two. I'm what's called an old Earth creationist. Yeah. So I believe that the Earth is as old as it looks. Yeah. And, geologically and all that. And I also believe that God created what was created for a very long period of time in those series of times. So I believe that instead of a 24-hour day, they were long.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but like very, very long.
And I should say that's a scriptural principle too, right? For those who are wondering, that scriptures talk about the idea of a day as being like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day to God in that regard as well, right?
Yeah, well, that word actually, yom, can be used. It's used for a set period of time, and it can be used to describe something that's less than a day and something that's much, much longer than a day. And we see both of those cases in the Old Testament. So there was definitely a time when I obviously am a biologist. I've spent many, many, many hours looking into macroevolutionary theory. I've studied it at length. I've read so many papers from so many different angles. But as for me, as a biologist, at this point, because of my scientific understanding, I cannot be convinced that the macroevolutionary process that we understand, that was laid out by Darwin, is possible, even biologically possible. Now, obviously, we know that there are changes over time because, microevolution. I mean, we've got dog breeds and horse breeds and different birds and all that thing. That's microevolution. I mean, you can watch that happen under a microscope. So that's pretty solidly proven. The problem I have with macroevolution is on one side, on the historical side, I don't have a problem with it. I could see how looking at the fossil record would indicate some changes over time. So I understand that. My problem is more with what we understand in terms of the timing of it and what we understand of genetics, and then also character of God questions. So, and again, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just laying out
No, this is good. This is what discussion should look like. Cool. This is good.
Yeah. So,
because I should say, it's funny because for me, if I'm honest too, I would probably lean a lot more to what you're saying there. But I leave myself, maybe I leave myself wriggle room. I don't know. Because part of me is like, well, I am not an expert in the field of the sciences. I have read on this issue. I have questions though about, and have always been troubled by macro evolution, and the idea that you get something completely different, out of what is, and also there's aspects of that mechanism that I think you're right. Because even within evolutionary theory, right, you have competing ideas like punctuated equilibrium, a big burst where everything arrives. You think that sounds a lot like old Earth creationism.
Part of that came out of trying to explain the Precambrian explosion, which is just absolutely confusing. Just all of a sudden you had all these new species that just popped out of nowhere. Looked a little bit like creationist neologism.
Suspicious.
Yeah, really. So there's a man called John Sanford who invented this incredible software called Mendel's Accountant, because he wanted to see how long it would have taken human beings to evolve from an ape-like predecessor. Yeah. And so he ran, he's just a brilliant geneticist. I mean, the guy invented the gene gun, like he's a genius. Yeah. So anyway, genius.
Dad joke. I'll do the dad jokes.
Dad joke for you.
I remember that one. Hey kids, come here. Dad's got something for you.
Yeah. Sorry. To all of your various children, I apologize. So anyway, he kept running this simulation again and again, and even under perfect conditions. It took longer than the known age of the universe just to get from an ape-like predecessor to a sort of a hominid that we understand as like a modern hominid. And so that's when he began digging more and more. And then he was saying, you know what, it's not actually possible because of the timing. Yeah. So that's one thing that I find compelling on the scientific side. On the other side, more philosophical, I think about the character of God and what does it mean for a creator to use a creative process which is inherently very destructive. We know that more than 99% of mutations are deleterious to the point of death. They're fatal. And so that's a strange thing to do. And then also why, I don't know. I don't understand why a God who would become weak in order to save, would create a process where only the strong survive, where it's survival of the fittest. So, it has to be, in order for a population to be healthy, you've got to get rid of the vulnerable and the weak. And so I see a lot of counters, I think, from his character.
And those are excellent points. And I think for me, the biggest thing of all for me is that even though I've shifted from a very strict young earth, literal 7-day creationist position, I don't have any issue with people who take that, hold that view. I don't have there's nothing inside me at all in the discussion we've had where I'm thinking, oh no, she believes that. Nothing at all. Because the big thing for me is the overarching thing is I've realized Scripture is not written as a scientific manual. The fundamental truths we still agree on are actually fundamentally true. And also, I'm open to the fact that, like, if it is, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a literal, and both of us, maybe it is a literal 7 days.
Oh, there's so much
and it's like, it doesn't bother me. you know?
Yeah, we need to have the intellectual humility
Mm.
to step back and say, "Hey, I could be wrong."
Yeah.
And that's the beautiful thing too about Christianity is it does allow, as you say, wiggle room, right? I am a biologist, and even I have a lot of wiggle room because I know there are things we're probably believing now that are false. That
Yeah.
everyone's like, well, science proves this. That in another 300 years, we're all going to be like, oh, that's hilarious that people believe that back then, because that's the trend. That's how the history of science goes. But at the end of the day, no matter which one of those camps you fall into, they all say, in the beginning, God, in the
Yeah.
beginning, we had this loving creator who brought these things into existence for his own purpose and his own glory. And I have dear friends in each one of those camps as well.
See, here's the thing, and if you're ignorant of the true history of the church and its whole relationship to science, then you're not going to understand that there's no issue with that discussion we've just had. And we could have added a third party who's a literal 7-day creationist, young earther, and there still wouldn't have been an issue because for the history of the church, apart from these sort of momentary little brief outbursts where things perhaps mistakes are made, it seems to me that science is really sort of this. It's a beautiful dance between faith and knowledge, and it's not this harsh separation of the two at all.
And I love how Hebrews defines faith. It talks about how faith is the assurance of things that are not seen. And a lot of scientifically minded people would look at that and they'd say, well, that's just terrible. I can't believe science is about observation and faith is about believing in something you can't see. Of course, that's anti-science, right? But if you read a little further in that same passage, it says, by faith, we understand that the universe was created out of what was not seen.
Yeah.
And that's so beautiful to me because, again, it's showing us how faith allows for greater understanding, greater understanding of a reality that a lot of times you can't see. I mean, you can't put love into a test tube.
No.
You can't measure justice on some mathematical scale. And these metaphysical things are true and real, and they're part of our everyday reality. So certainly we do have to make room for a creator, make room for a God behind it all.
I want to ask you a couple of questions just to wrap things up with. First one, your specialty really is, and your passion, it seems, is in the environment and environmental related science. I've heard you talk about this before because it seems to me that environmentalism has now been captured by a whole lot of very anti-human ideologies that have actually gone away from the science. And one of the things I heard you talk about, actually the first time I heard you speak, it was fascinating. You talked about the science, which actually shows us that ecosystems with healthy human intervention actually thrive better, they flourish better than ones that have no human intervention at all. Yet environmentalism would seem to be saying to us, if you got rid of humans, the environment would be a better place.
Right. There are some philosophies that say that, and that's called reservation theory. So reservation theory is basically you put a nice fence around it and don't let any people in. Just keep nature there, because if humans interact with nature, it will be destroyed. And that is not good on either end. So then you've got restoration theory, which is we will send people into a degraded ecosystem to try and bring it back to life, because on one sense, there's a level of culpability there because oftentimes we're the ones who've degraded it. And also it just comes back to life so much more quickly when we're involved, right? Translocating species and planting things and stuff. And the third theory, which is where I've been really interested, is called reconciliation. Isn't that an interesting word?
It is.
Reconciliation ecology. So that says, how can humans and nature live together in harmony? Because it seems like we're meant for each other. It really does. Horticulture therapy, for example, after the First World War here in the United States, they did this study in hospitals, and they found that wounded soldiers healed and recovered physically and psychologically so much more quickly when they were in a horticultural setting than when they were just in a hospital bed. And that's why a lot of hospitals now have a garden in the middle, there's where patients can go, because it does increase their healing immensely. And then on the other side, which is baffling restorationists and ecologists all over the place, but you look at the data and it's true that it bothers us because it seems like there's a level of hegemony when we go out into nature and take ownership of it.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is biodiversity explodes when that happens in a really beautiful way. Now, humans can degrade nature. Of course we can. We can degrade it or restore it better than any other natural force on this planet. But I think all of that just points us back ultimately to the fact that Genesis is true. Yeah. When it said that God appointed Adam and Eve over the garden to care for it and to nurture it and to grow it, I think that's a beautiful picture of humanity, that we are meant to go out and cultivate and grow and care for the earth, and the earth flourishes under our hands. So I don't think we should ever abuse it, but nor do I think we should cut ourselves off of it. Neither of those are good scenarios.
What would you say to Christians who are sort of grappling with the whole... because it seems now that perhaps this environmentalism almost now sort of has come into the church in a way at times that's a bit unhealthy, sort of an obsession on the created things rather than the creator, you might say. How do Christians grapple with that so they have a good environmental concern, but they don't fall prey to the excesses really in either direction that you can have there?
Well, I think, again, a good biblical understanding would aid that process quite a bit. I mean, we all know that one person who treats their dog better than they treat any other human beings, and so it's obviously not good to worship nature or to put humans down at the very, very bottom and say, we're a virus on this planet. We don't belong here. And nor should we deify nature and worship it, as many people are resorting to different forms of animism, like modern forms of animism, which I find really interesting. So, the Bible says that we are stewards over nature, but at the same time, there's a level of culpability where we are responsible for how we treat nature. Yeah. Like, you will not muzzle the ox while he treads the grain, right? He's making food for you, so you let him eat first because of his work, right? So, I mean, and we see shadows of that all through the Old Testament and the New Testament of God's respect for nature and how he's teaching us to respect nature. And I always come back to the Garden of Eden, and one of the first commands that he gave to Adam was, you can eat all of these fruits, but here's this one tree that you can't touch. Don't touch that tree. And I know that was more about Adam's relationship with God, but I find it fascinating that the Lord is creating these parameters for humanity, and he's using his nature to do that. Yeah. And I think he's still doing that now, right? There are shadows of, like Proverbs says, the man who treats his livestock well is a righteous man, and the man who abuses his livestock is an unrighteous man. You can tell a lot what's going on inside of someone by how they're treating others and how they're treating nature. So I think that's where we can go for a more healthy view of what our relationship is to nature and how we envisage that through our relationship to God.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think of a lot of the great Christian thinkers throughout history, and some of the big names, William Wilberforce, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and they all have this very beautiful love of nature. And they also, particularly Lewis and Tolkien, I think about, they were concerned about this growing industrial revolution and the impact that technology was actually having on the beauty of this gift of the environment. They both had a love of trees, for example. So the idea that Christianity is this sort of, we hate science and we'll destroy the environment, it's just completely not true, right?
Yeah, it's terrible. And certainly there are fringe groups that have done both of those things that are, really terrible. Yeah. But that's not the core of who we are as a people, and it's certainly not the core of Christ's message at all.
One last question to finish with. The state of science itself as an institution, because it seems to me science was the last of the human institutions, if you like, that still had not fallen prey to that cynical We don't trust you anymore. Like the church had fallen, government had fallen, but science was still the thing that we clung to as the last institution that was going to tell us the truth and lead us. But it seems more and more that is actually evaporating. I'm reading a book at the moment, just published, brand new book by a psychologist actually who loves science. He's an atheist. And it's called Science Fictions, about all of these crises within science of not telling the truth, of bias, of peer review process flaws, of faked research. And he's writing the book because he wants science to be safe. But what's your take on that? Do you sense that science, because some people would try and think science is at its pinnacle right now, but it seems to me that actually if you look at a little bit beneath the surface, there's some real problems for it as a trusted institution in society?
I think of science as a kingdom sometimes, and, like its own realm in a way. But there's this beautiful Latin phrase, which I love, which says, Deus scientiarum dominus. God is king of the sciences. Yeah. And I think, he is Lord of the sciences, as he's Lord of every kingdom. And it's good that we have science, and it's beautiful that we're using it to learn things and grow and help people and gain knowledge and all that. But at the end of the day, without Christ, it's nothing. Yeah. It's nothing. It's just moving more quickly in the wrong direction. It's a very strong horsepower engine in a car that is going the wrong way down the highway and doomed for destruction. If we just keep going so quickly and progressing and all of these, modern inventions and all this stuff, but there are no parameters, there are no boundaries, there's no moral understanding, there's no ethics there, we're just going to crash. Of course we're going to crash. Christ is the answer. Jesus is the answer, the ultimate answer. And all of what I see in science ultimately keeps pointing me back to him. So anytime you put your trust in anything that isn't him, it's eventually going to evaporate. Money, self-image, knowledge, social status, whatever it is, someday it's going to be dust. Yeah. The only thing that lasts is the person of Jesus Christ, and that is the bedrock on which we need to build our lives. And it saddens me, almost depresses me, to see beautiful people who are so brilliant in the laboratory, who are using their minds to do incredible things, but they refuse to consider the existence of a God. They won't go there. They refuse to consider it because of those ramifications. So it saddens me, but does not surprise me. Yeah. With what's happening with science, yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? It's almost like a humility thing, because again, if you have a view of the world where you say there's a transcendent reality, there is a God, he's bigger than I am, I owe him my worship, then automatically that's an act of I must be humble. And it's interesting how science really, I think, lost touch with humility. That the phrase you often hear, scientific hubris. And it became more and more, and it seems now that what we're starting to see is that lack of humility. All these various... It's interesting watching the COVID crisis unfold, and now there's a resurgence of this whole idea of, you must never question the expert. I read an article just today saying this, you must never question the experts. And what I think is lacking there is that appropriate level of humility where you say, well, it's kind of a dance, isn't it, where the experts, through humility, give us their gifts, but it's always a dance. It's not just we submit ourselves and never question.
Right. And again, there should be accountability. You shouldn't ever just believe something that someone very smart says, because they could be very smart about how they're being wrong. We've all been given this gift of human reason, so anyone can use it, and you shouldn't say that because you don't have a PhD you don't have a say, or you're not allowed to consider and think and ponder and question. Those are gifts from God too.
On that note, just to finish with, what are there books or resources that you would recommend that people actually engage with? So maybe they're religious believers, or maybe they're outside of the church and they want to explore these questions, science, faith, a bit more. Are there resources, are there books that you think people should dive into?
Yeah, okay, good question. So yeah, there's a couple probably different types of people who might be viewing this. For young people who they're Christian and they're feeling like they're going against some of the mainstream things that are being taught in their university or whatever, and they're just trying to think, how can I do this properly as a Christian? I would recommend a book called Against the Flow by Lennox. And Against the Flow is not necessarily about science. It's about Daniel from the Bible, but it is about living in a particular society where you feel like you're constantly going against the grain, and what does that mean for you, and what does it mean like to stand out like a sore thumb all the time. So I'd recommend that for any young professionals or young scientists who are struggling with those things that I certainly struggled with. And then for the environmental side, I'd probably recommend a very short book by Alistair McGrath. And it's called Re-Enchanting Nature, or The Re-Enchantment of Nature. I can never remember. It's one of those titles. Have you read it?
I haven't read it, but I know the book. It's on my to-do list. My wife's getting concerned about the ever-increasing Tower of Babel that is made of books beside our bed.
That's all right. If you're going to have a giant tower of stuff in your house, it's better to have it be books than like laundry or, something else. There are worse things that could tower up in your house. And then I'm just trying to think right now for a good book to recommend to someone who is scientifically minded and wants to pursue maybe why Christianity might be true. And the only ones I'm thinking of, again, are Lennox, sorry. But there's one that's called God's Undertaker.
Oh, yes, yep.
Which is great. Has science buried God, right? So John Lennox talks about that at length. So sorry, I'm just going with all the Oxford guys for my book recommendations, but they're wonderful writers. So yeah.
You could do worse if you're quoting someone from Oxford. Now tell me, what about your work? How do people follow you? You write blogs. Obviously you've got a YouTube channel. How do people follow you and your work and your thought that you're putting out there?
Yeah, so I have one blog called Spiritual Lessons from Biology, and it's about biological research or discoveries or interesting animals or interesting behaviors, and also what we can learn about God or what we can learn about spiritual things from that, sort of kind of like Proverbs style. And then I also sometimes will write for Thinking Matters, which you mentioned. We both spoke at a conference there. So, and then I have a website, which is just called XandraCarrollMinistries.com. So it's pretty easy to remember. It's just my name, ministries.com. So yeah, they can follow me that way. And then the YouTube channel as well. Just search for my name.
We'll make sure we put a link for those in the video description, folks. So if you're watching this later, you can track it down nice and easy. Alexandra, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to sit and have this conversation with us. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully our listeners have found it engaging and informative as well. So thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.